Most, if not all of you, have heard of neurons. And if you remember the histology portion of this class, which seems like a long time ago, it's only a couple of weeks, we did talk about neurons and we talked about the supporting cells, the neuroglia. Neurons are going to have three general regions. The dendrites, which are those long projections off the cell body, they're sort of branched. They will receive stimuli from the environment or from other neurons. The cell body itself, also known as the soma, S-O-M-A, it'll contain a nucleus, it'll contain a lot of other organelles, mitochondria, ER, etc. I want you to remember that the cell body can also be receptive. What does that mean? It means that the cell body can actually pick up information from other neurons. So the dendrites and the cell body are receptive surfaces of a neuron. The axon is going to carry information away, axon away, they both start with A, away from the cell body towards something at the distal end. So the axon's job is to move information, not material, but information, away from the cell body towards something that it's going to signal or talk to through neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters, yes, chemical messengers of the nervous system. At the distal end, you will see those little bulb-like structures, which can be called multiple things. Axon terminals, synaptic end knobs, synaptic end bulbs, among others. We'll talk more about those. The axon has certain components, which include what's known as the axon hillock. That is the origin of the axon from the cell body. And it's just this sort of widening, narrowing of the cell body and widening of the axon. The initial segment is where the action potential is going to be initiated and sent along the axon. The axolemma is going to be the axon's cell membrane, plasma membrane. Remember how we talked about sarcolemma being a skeletal muscle cell's plasma membrane? There you go, axolemma. Axoplasm, you betcha, it's going to be the cytoplasm that is found within the axon. And that is what it'll contain. Telodendria are the branches that end at the synaptic terminals or the synaptic end bulbs or the axon terminals. Yes, you need to know the multiple names for those. I put these terms in here so you see them. You should be able to figure out what many of them are, well, at least some of them, i.e. the axolemma and the axoplasm, because we've seen terms that look like that. I cannot remember ever putting one of these on an assessment, but you never know. So here we go again. You can see the dendrites. You can see the cell body, which will have nucleus, nucleolus, mitochondria, Golgi bodies, endoplasmic reticulum, etc. And then you can see the axon. You can see the axon hillock, which is labeled the initial segment, which is just distal to the axon hillock. The axolemma, again, is the plasma membrane, or the membrane around the axon, you bet, and the axoplasm is found within the axon. You can see the telodendria and the axon terminals. I call them synaptic end bulbs because that's how I learned them. In this case, you have this neuron speaking with another neuron. And you can see that some of those axon terminals, the synaptic end bulbs, are either talking to or connecting with dendrites or the actual cell body of the next neuron. So, can we replace neurons? Most of them are going to lack centrioles. So if that's the case, you can't divide. So if you lose them to injury or disease, if you're drinking too much or doing too many drugs and you're losing neurons, oh boy, too bad, so sad. They are seldom replaced. There are some neural stem cells. Most are going to be inactive. There are some exceptions. The olfactory epithelium. Those keep reproducing. The retina of the eye. That'll keep reproducing. Yahoo! And the hippocampus, which is a small area within the brain that is associated with memory. Again, you've seen a lot of this already. You've seen the dendrites. You've seen the cell body, nucleus and nucleoli in the body, cell body. You can see the axon. And in this image, you can also see what are known as myelin sheaths. Those myelin sheaths are a lipoprotein that wraps around the axon and speeds the rate of the action potential. It's going to speed the transmission of an action potential up to about 250 or 300 miles an hour. They're super fast if they're traveling on axons that are myelinated. Now, take a look at that term Schwann cells. Schwann cells make myelin in the peripheral nervous system. Let me repeat that. Schwann cells make myelin within the peripheral nervous system, not in the central nervous system, not in the brain and the spinal cord. If you see a Schwann cell, you know that neuron has to be in the peripheral nervous system by definition. Remember that. This shows you another image. You can see the dendrites, you can see the cell body, you can see the axon, you can see the myelin sheaths. Now take a look-see at that little cell that you can see just underneath the label nucleus. You see it kind of looks like an eye and it's got a bunch of processes. I can tell you right now that this cell is within the central nervous system. And how do I know that? Because that cell is what's known as an oligodendrocyte. Don't panic. We will see that term in the next section when we talk about the neuroglia. Oligodendrocytes make myelin sheaths for multiple axons within the central nervous system. So why don't they just make one myelin sheath? Because you have axons that are so tightly packed in the central nervous system that you can have a single cell that has multiple processes that make myelin sheaths for axons. Remember the Schwann cells we just talked about? In the peripheral nervous system, Schwann cells, each Schwann cell makes one myelin sheath. In the peripheral nervous system, you're going to find Schwann cell, and each Schwann cell makes a single myelin sheath. Back to this picture, the oligodendrocytes make multiple myelin sheaths for multiple axons. Oligodendrocytes will make multiple myelin sheaths for multiple axons. And hang on to those questions because we will go over it, and I have a great image to show you when we're going over the neuroglia. Now, let's go to the distal end of that axon, and you can see the synaptic end bulb, synaptic terminal, whatever you're going to call it. And you'll also see that there's a line that leads to what's known as a synapse. Synapse is this tiny little space in between the synaptic end bulb and the next neuron, or the effector of that neuron. It's a tiny little space. It's known as the synaptic cleft or the synapse. The synaptic end bulb is going to release a neurotransmitter, which will travel across that synapse and get picked up by a receptor or receptors on the next neuron. The membrane, that cell membrane of the next neuron, is known as the postsynaptic membrane because it is after that synaptic cleft, after the synapse. The membrane of the neuron that you can see in yellow, that we've just been talking about, that membrane will be, what a convenience, the presynaptic membrane, because it is found before that synapse or synaptic cleft. So think about that, and we can go over that again if you have questions when we meet in class. Oops, sorry, I went too fast. So we talked about a synapse. It shows you a lovely picture of one. We got an even better one, or a bigger one on the next slide. The synapse is where the neuron, that is the presynaptic cell, communicates with another cell, the postsynaptic cell. And in this case, we're talking about neurons. The most common type will release a neurotransmitter into the synaptic cleft, which we talked about. That neurotransmitter will cross the synaptic cleft and bind to receptors on the opposite side of the synapse. Then those receptors are on the postsynaptic membrane. Those neurotransmitters are going to be packaged and held in vesicles within the synaptic end bulb. And the fact that you have multiple branches at the distal end of an axon means that a single neuron can communicate with a whole bunch of different cells. I like this image because it shows you the presynaptic membrane and it shows you the postsynaptic membrane. And that little space in between is the synaptic cleft. So let's look at another image of this. There you go. This is one synaptic end bulb. You can see that it contains vesicles which will contain a neurotransmitter. It will contain vesicles that contain a neurotransmitter. So what is a neurotransmitter? Neurotransmitters are the chemical messengers of the nervous system. You can see that the space in between the synaptic end bulb and the specialized area of the cell that's receiving that neurotransmitter is known as the synapse or the synaptic cleft. So what happens? Synaptic vesicles will expel the neurotransmitter through the process of exocytosis. That neurotransmitter will diffuse across the synaptic cleft and get picked up by receptors on the postsynaptic membrane. And in this case, it says it's on a dendrite. That will trigger a cascade of events which may lead to an action potential in another neuron. If you remember when we talked about skeletal muscle, we talked about how there is a synaptic end bulb that is going to synapse with a motor end plate, which is a specialized area of the sarcolemma. The neurotransmitter acetylcholine is held in synaptic vesicles within that synaptic end bulb. It will be released via exocytosis. It will diffuse across the synaptic cleft. It will get picked up by receptors on the motor end plate and trigger a cascade of events that will lead to skeletal muscle contraction. Same idea here, except in this case, we're talking to another neuron. And how do we know that? Because the word dendrites is right there. This shows you presynaptic, postsynaptic membranes. Just wanted to mention those. The neuron that is in black and bright yellow is the presynaptic neuron, and the neuron that is sort of grayish, is sort of grayed out, is the postsynaptic neuron. So we have different types of synapses, because a neuron, if it's partnered with another neuron, as are millions of neurons in the central nervous system, it can talk to another neuron, so it'll synapse with that neuron. We've already talked about neuromuscular junctions. So the motor neuron in this case is communicating with a muscle. In this case, it's a skeletal muscle. And you also might have neuroglandular synapses in which a neuron is going to direct a gland. You will remember that the effectors of the central nervous system are muscles and glands. The effectors of the central nervous system are muscles and glands, and that is why we have the neuromuscular junction, and that is why we have the neuroglandular junction. And I just like this picture because it's pretty cool. It shows you a bunch of neurons that are interconnected. Fabulous. What you can find on the internet.